Hello class, this is your lecture on angiosperm families and human uses. Let's get started. Your outline is as follows, and I understand that this outline is a bit overwhelming because it has a lot of scientific names on it, but we're going to go through these plant families one by one, and hopefully by the end of this lecture, these plant family names will be less intimidating. First, we'll talk about the origin of cultivated plants, which is to say, how did humans first start using plants around the world many centuries ago. And then we'll talk about 16 selected families of flowering plants, including 13 families from the dicots and 3 families from the monocots. Cultivated plants appear to have originated in 6 major regions, and different textbook authors and scholars have different ideas on this, but for this class we're going to go with this idea that there are 6, and of course this is a bit arbitrary, but it gives us a framework from which to understand where native plants first evolved. So the first so-called region is the Near Eastern region, which includes the Mediterranean and Northern Europe. We can see a variety of different crops originated in this place, which is to say the ancestors of our modern day crops evolved as native species in these places. And for our exams, I just want you to know the first 3. So it's quite a long list. In Mediterranean regions in Northern Europe, we have things like barley and wheat, both of which are very important grains. Also peas, which are legumes, and a variety of other crops, including lentils, asparagus, beets, carrots, turnips, olives, cherries, apricots, apples, onions, garlic, broccoli, and lettuce are all from the Mediterranean regions. Number 2 is the Chinese region, and this includes temperate and southern China. Things like soybeans, peaches, and walnuts are from China, as well as things like ginger, gourds, camphor, tea, bamboo, buckwheat, horseradish, and cucumber. And of course, we say these things are native to China originally, but now they can be grown around the world as long as the agricultural conditions are appropriate. Next up is a huge region, the African continent. But when we talk about Africa, we're mostly talking about North Africa, especially Ethiopia, and also West Africa. That's where things like yams, sorghum, and okra come from, as well as many types of melons, coffee, and some types of cotton. And sorghum you may or may not have heard of. It's a grain, it's a type of grass, and it is used extensively in African cuisine. Some of you might have had okra before. Some people don't like it because it's kind of slimy or mucilaginous, but we often serve it deep fried and it's quite delicious. Our next region is South Asia and Pacific Islands. That's where things like sugarcane, eggplant, and mango come from. Now, in temperate regions of the world, such as here in the United States, we can't grow sugar cane. The temperatures aren't hot and humid enough. So instead, we use beets here in the United States for sugar and in temperate regions. But in tropical regions, it's sugar cane, and we import tons of sugar derived from sugar cane throughout the world. Other South Asian and Pacific Island crops include things like bananas, citrus, safflower, nutmeg, clove, cardamom, black pepper, coconut, rice, sesame, and onions. Now in North America, of course that's where California is, there's not very many crops. Even though we grow tons of crops in California, California is one of the agricultural centers of North America. Native to this region are just plants like sunflowers, cranberries, blueberries, and tobacco. And then finally 6, South and Central America. That is a huge list of crops. We're just going to look at a few. Garden beans, which are legumes, corn, which is a grain, so that's related to grasses, and peanuts, which are interesting because they form underground. Other types of crops include things like white potatoes, lima beans, cashews, pineapples, avocado, red pepper, tomato, cotton, and then different types of drugs too. Of course, these aren't things that we want to consume, but because there is a historical perspective on this, things like cocaine, which comes from the coca plant, is from South America, And then cacao, which is chocolate, comes from South America. Sweet potatoes, pumpkins, squash, rubber plant, and vanilla. So it's quite an extensive list. Of course, not all these things we eat. Some of them are just for historical perspectives, like those narcotics and rubber. All right, so that's a few words about the origin of cultivated plants. Now let's look at a selected list of our plant families. Now, flowering plant families, which is to say the angiosperms, are split into the monocots and dicots. But the fancy word for dicots is classified as the eudicots. Notice that spelling of the word, it begins with the letters EU. Dicots, therefore, are broken down into a more primitive group called the magnoliids and the more derived group, which is called the eudicots. Now we're going to look at a list of families, and the classifications that we use all come from the angiosperm phylogeny group, which is a collective of scientists from around the world that use molecular evidence to place different genera into respective families. And based upon molecular evidence, we're often shifting different genera into different families. The most primitive of the dicot families, and also sister family to all eudicots, is the Ranunculaceae. This is the buttercup family. There's nearly 2,500 species, so it's relatively small because remember in the angiosperms there's over 300,000 species, and they all have these characteristics. The petals vary in number, there's numerous stamens, there's several to many carpels with superior ovaries, and the buttercup family is concentrated in north temperate and Arctic regions. Many members of this family are poisonous, and all of them are at least slightly poisonous due to the production of biochemicals called secondary metabolites. We're going to learn 3 different plants that belong to the buttercup family: columbine, monkshood, and hepatica. And the first 2 we find in California. So columbine is unique because it has 5 spurred petals, which are adapted to hummingbird pollination. Monkshood or wolfsbane has a unique corolla part that looks like a hood. And then hepatica has radial flowers. Now, let's take a look at monkshood first. So monkshood produces the chemical called akinetine, and this is a powerful alkaloid. It is used as a drug in Chinese medicine, but of course, you don't want to be experimenting with this unless you're under the direction of a medical doctor. And it's very, very poisonous to herbivores. That's why these plants evolve these chemicals, because it deters the herbivores from eating them. Some history: monkshood flowers and their parts were often harvested by wolf hunters because they could use the juice from the plant to poison wolves because it's so poisonous. Our next family is the Lauraceae, which is the laurel family. And again, it's relatively small. There's about 2,500 species, and it's quite primitive as well. As we go through these plant families, we start with the most primitive, and then we get to the most advanced or derived families. Most of them are tropical evergreen shrubs and trees, but we do have some in California, including the California bay laurel. The flowers are primitive because they have no petals, but they do have sepals that sometimes appear petal-like. The stamens are in 3 or 4 whorls, and they have anthers that open by flaps that lift up to release the pollen. There are some important species that belong to the laurel family that humans use, including cinnamon. We take the bark of the cinnamon tree, which is a small tree that grows in the understory of tropical forests. Sweet bay, which is a flavoring for meat dishes and soups and other things. And avocado, which is a huge crop in California They belong to the laurel family. Next up is the poppy family, and this is the Papaveraceae. It's quite small. There's only 800 species of herbs that are found in temperate and subtropical regions. There are numerous stamens in these flowers, but just one single carpel, and they usually produce a milky or colored sap. All of the species produce alkaloids, and some of them are very poisonous, but not all. For example, opium poppies. These are flowers in which, after they are fertilized, produce their fruit, which is a capsule, and then people can harvest that opium from those capsules. We can see a picture here where the capsule has been marked with a razor blade, and the alkaloids just secrete out of that capsule. From that opium poppy, morphine and codeine are produced, and we can also use those flowers to produce the illegal drug, which is heroin. So that's some history there on the opium poppy. Interestingly, these poppy seeds themselves are legal and edible to eat because they don't contain that powerful drug. Of course, in California, our state flower is the California poppy, which belongs to this family. Next up is the Brassicaceae, which is the mustard family. It's relatively small, just under 4,000 species, and we find it mostly in temperate and cooler regions of North America. We have tons of mustards, both native and weedy species, in California. The flowers are as such. They tend to have 4 flower petals arranged in a cross. They have 6 stamens that are interesting because they are in 2 series. There's 2 short stamens and 4 long stamens. And the fruits are siliques or silicles, which are dry types of fruits. We have many cultivated edible plants from the mustard family, including things like cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, broccoli, radish, turnips, horseradish, watercress, and rutabaga. If you ever put mustard on your hamburger or hot dog or your veggie burger, that mustard condiment comes from the ground seeds of 2 species from the genus Brassica. Next up is the rose family, which is the Rosaceae. It's again relatively small. There's about 2,500 species, but it's quite diverse. There's trees, shrubs, and herbs, so all types of plants. The flowers have basal parts that are fused into a cup. The petals, sepals, and numerous stamens are all typically attached to the cup's rim, and this flower pattern is called the hypanthium, which is unique to the roses. The family is so diverse that taxonomists have to subdivide it into subfamilies based upon the flower structure and the fruits. The rose family has enormous economic impact. We have things like the stone fruits, which includes cherries, apricots, peaches, and plums. The pome fruits, which is the apples and the pears. The aggregates, which is the strawberries, blackberries, and raspberries. Then we have tons of garden ornamentals, including the classic roses. Many different scientists can get fragrances and different aromas from these plants. And the fruits of roses are loaded with vitamin C, so they are grown in cultivation to produce commercial vitamin C, which maybe some of you take as a supplement for its immune boosting abilities. Next up is the Fabaceae, which is the legume family, and this is one of the largest plant families in the world. It depends upon which scientist you're talking to, but many classify it as the 3rd largest of the flowering plant families, with about 19,000 species. And if you check out the plantlist.org, that'll have some really nice information about plant evolution. Now, we refer to the legume family as cosmopolitan, and that's because it's found all around the world. The flowers are quite diverse. They're radial to bilateral, and the stamens are generally fused into a tube around the ovary, and that ovary could be superior or inferior, so it's quite diverse. The fruits of the legumes are called legumes, so that's kind of nice, and it's always derived from one single carpel. And we have lots of important crop plants, including peas, beans, soybeans, peanuts, alfalfa, sweet clover, licorice, and carob. Next up is the Euphorbiaceae, which is the spurge family. Many of you probably have never heard of the spurge family, but it's quite large. There's 6,700 species approximately, and it's concentrated in tropical regions, but we also have many native right here to California, which is a more temperate region. There are several economically important plants in the spurge family, including cassava root, which is a staple food in tropical regions. Another name for cassava is manioc or tapioca, which is what they use for bubble teas. And then the rubber tree. This is where we can make natural crude rubber from the latex of the inner bark. The stamens and carpels are produced in separate unisexual flowers in the spurge family, and the flowers are often inconspicuous and lack a corolla. So therefore, to attract pollinators, they often have bracts. For example, we can see a picture of poinsettia, and that poinsettia is a flower that you might see in the holidays for sale at Trader Joe's or at grocery stores, and it has these red bracts that look like flowers. Now, when we look at the anatomy of a spurge flower, the inflorescence is called a cyathium, and the cyathium is composed of a female flower elevated on a stalk called the gynophore and surrounded by several male flowers that each consist of little more than an anther. The male and female flowers are inserted on a cup composed of fused bracts, sometimes with glands on the rim. Those glands are usually nectaries that attract the pollinators. Finally, sometimes, not always, but sometimes or even often we might say, these cyathium inflorescence are surrounded by colored bracts. Our next family is the Cactaceae, which is the cactus family. Very iconic plants. There's about 1,800 species that are native only to the Americas in dry, subtropical regions, often found in deserts. The leaves are reduced in size, often as spines, but not always, and they typically have fleshy, photosynthetic stems, and that fleshiness is an adaptation to store water. Cactus flowers are usually very showy, with numerous stamens, petals, and sepals, and an inferior ovary that develops into a berry. Most members of the cactus family have an edible fruit. For example, prickly pear fruits are animal dispersed. Here we can see a picture of a land tortoise eating one of those fruits, and then of course later on they'll poop out the seeds to disperse. Next up is the mint family, which is the Lamiaceae. There's about 7,000 species worldwide, and they have a unique combination of both angular stems that are square in cross-section, opposite leaves, and bilaterally symmetrical flowers. Ovaries that are superior tend to be in the mint family, and that ovary is often four-parted, developing into a structure botanists refer to as four nutlets. Members of the mint family have a lot of economic impact. For example, many of them produce mint oils that are used for medicines as well as antiseptics in many different parts of the world. Menthol can be used in toothpaste, candies, gum, and medications. There's also many culinary herbs from the mint family, including rosemary, thyme, sage, oregano, marjoram, basil, lavender, catnip, peppermint, and spearmint, to name a few. Our next family is the nightshade family, and this is the Solanaceae. There's about 2,400 species concentrated in tropical regions of Central and South America. The flowers have fused petals with stamens that are then fused to the corolla. So we refer to this as epipetalous stamens. They tend to have a superior ovary that will develop into a berry or a capsule. There are many important plants that humans use, including tomatoes, white potatoes, eggplants, peppers, tobacco, and petunia, to name a few. Many nightshades are poisonous, and some have drug uses, and that's because of alkaloids that are found in these plants. Now, if you have your potatoes at home, you might see that they develop green spots sometimes, and you never want to eat a potato that has a green spot, because the green spot is evidence that solanine has built up in the potato, which is poisonous. Next up is the Apiaceae, which is the carrot family. There's less than 4,000 members, widely distributed across the northern hemisphere. It includes savory aromatic herbs with dissected leaves and petiole bases that form from sheaths around the stem. The flowers are small, numerous, and arranged in an inflorescence called the umbel. They tend to have an inferior ovary and a two-lobed stigma, and some important plants that humans use include dill, celery, carrots, parsley, caraway, coriander, fennel, anise, and parsnip. Some members are highly poisonous. You never want to even touch these plants because just touching them can get the poison on your hand. For example, water hemlock, which grows around the world, including here in California, can kill you if you eat just a tiny bit. In fact, it's believed that Socrates might have died from its ingestion. Next up is the Cucurbitaceae, which is the pumpkin family. It's about 1,000 species of prostrate, low-growing, herbaceous vines. The flowers are unisexual with fused petals, and the female flowers will always have an inferior ovary with 3 carpels. There are many important edible plants in the pumpkin family, all of which are botanically classified as the peepos, which are types of berries. That includes things like pumpkins, squashes, cucumbers, cantaloupes, and gourds. Now, when you look at a cantaloupe, you know how it has that net-like appearance on the rind? Well, that's because it's loaded up with suberin, that waxy substance. Next up is the sunflower family, the so-called Asteraceae. This is one of the largest flowering plant families in the world, with 22 to 27,000 species, and the high end includes currently unresolved species on the Tree of Life. Different plants in the sunflower family include, of course, sunflowers from its name, and sunflowers are very important because they provide oils and a food source for many different types of commercial interests. Also, dandelions, lettuce, endive, chicory, artichoke, dahlia, chrysanthemum, marigolds, and thistles are other important crops. Many of these are used for landscaping plants. Tarragon is a spice you may or may not have heard of. It's found in different blends that we use for meats and pickles, and it belongs to the sunflower family. And here in California, especially down by Gilroy and over by Half Moon Bay, we have lots of artichokes that are grown. Now, the sunflowers are unique because even though we see one big sunflower, that's not just one flower. That is an inflorescence that's made up of hundreds or thousands of individual flowers referred to as the florets. The florets are arranged in a compact inflorescence that resembles a single flower, but it's not. And those florets may be unisexual or bisexual. They often have a reduced corolla that may have a long strap-like extension. All right, So that's our list of dicots. Now let's look at just 3 families of monocots. And while I keep the monocot list short, they're all very, very important to understand. The first monocot family is the grass family, which is the Poaceae. And this is very big, 11,000 species. They often have flowers that are wind pollinated and highly specialized. In fact, they're so highly specialized that we can't use the flower language that we've learned in this class. Grasses have their own language around flowers, but we don't have to memorize all the special names in my course. The calyx and the corolla are reduced to tiny scales with special names, and the stigmas, because they're wind pollinated, are usually exposed and feathery so that the pollen grains can easily just blow right in. Now when we look at grasses, the leaf bases almost always are going to be sheathing the stems. Grasses are so economically important. The grass family includes nearly all of the cereal grains, including wheat, barley, rye, oats, rice, and corn, just to name a few. Sugarcane is also a grass. It can grow to 6 meters tall, and we get the sugar out of this grass by cutting it down, of course, and then squeezing the juice out of the cane. Then we take that juice and we centrifuge it, and the solid crystallized substances are going to centrifuge to the outside, and we can use that as table sugar, and then the dark stuff at the bottom is the molasses. Grasses can also be used for basketry, fiber arts, and thatching for different building structures. Now, in the summertime, you might burn a citronella candle at your campsite or on your balcony because you want to keep the bugs away. And that citronella chemical comes from the citronella grass. Our next monocot family is the lily family. And there's over 600 species that belong to the Liliaceae. Now, in recent classification schemes, the lily family has been highly reduced. It used to have over 4,000 species, but based upon molecular evidence, we took many of those genera and we placed them in their own families. So what's left in the lily family are those species that basically look like the tiger lily we can see on the screen. It has flowers that are large and with parts in multiples of 3. The sepals and petals usually resemble each other, and in that case we refer to them as the tepals. Now, this whole revisioning of the lily family phylogeny first started in the 1980s. That's when taxonomists put lots of groups into the lily family, but then about 20 years later, that's when scientists started to figure out that, that wasn't really accurate. And based upon molecular evidence, they placed members of the lily family into their own families. And again, for this class, we want to go with the system that the angiosperm phylogeny groups, which is going to give the most accurate classification data. Many members of the lily family have alkaloids, and one member of the lily family, which is called the corn lily, makes cyclopamine. It's from the plant called Veratrum californicum, which grows in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. And if sheep graze fields that have corn lily in it and they're pregnant, then they can give birth to baby lambs that have cyclopia. And that cyclopia is a disorder in which, of course, it's a stillborn, but it only has one big eye in the middle of its head. So it's kind of a weird and terrifying disorder that comes from eating this member of the lily family. Of course, humans would never want to eat this plant. It would kill you. And the last family to learn for the monocots is the orchid family, the so-called Orchidaceae. It's very large, about 27,000 species worldwide, very abundant in the tropics, but we have some native orchids right here in California as well. It's widely distributed with very diverse habitats, and the flowers are exceptionally varied in size and form, all of them having very specific relationships with pollinators. Many orchids are epiphytic, meaning they grow on the sides of trees. Others are aquatic, and others are terrestrial or even saprophytic. A saprophyte is a plant or an orchid that lives off of dead or decaying organic matter. And because they can steal all of their nutrients, they usually have no chlorophyll present. Humans do cultivate many orchids commercially as decorative houseplants. That's a huge multi-million-dollar industry. But also vanilla. That delicious flavoring comes from a species of vanilla orchids. The flowers of orchids are unique because they have 3 sepals and petals, with one of the petals, called the lip petal, differing from the other 2. And that lip petal is what interacts with the pollinator in a very specific way. Stamens and carpels tend to be united into a single structure called the column, and the anthers contain sacs of pollen called pollinia. So, kind of like how grasses, we can't use the typical language of a flower, the orchids are the same. Orchids have to have their own special language to describe their flowers. Orchids produce tiny seeds. They're so small that they're almost microscopic. They consist of just a few cells, and they're highly specialized. The seeds won't even germinate unless they become associated with a very specific mycorrhizal fungus. So, highly specialized plants. All right, well, in review, we've now learned all about the origin of cultivated plants, which is to say, where did our modern crops evolve on our planet? And we've learned a list of 16 different flowering plant families and some of their human uses.